Your Bibles with me and turning them to Genesis chapter 19 this morning. And Pastor Alex, would you drop the choir lights if you would? So for this morning's text, I want to essentially provide an outline for us before we venture into it so that you'll understand the three threads or the three storylines that we're going to be tracking this morning in Genesis 19. The three storylines that we're going to be tracing and marking and mapping as we go through the text, the first is this. We want to see if God is righteous in extinguishing Sodom and Gomorrah. That's the first storyline we want to follow. Is God righteous in wiping these people off the face of the earth? Is that a righteous decision? That's the first storyline we want to follow. The second storyline we want to follow is Lot's poor decisions throughout the duration of his life and where those decisions got him in the end. That's the second storyline. So first, is God righteous in wiping the Sodomites off the planet? Two, we want to trace Lot's decisions and where they got him so that we might learn from it. And then third, we want to stand with Abraham as he stands where he met with the Lord and overlooked Sodom and Gomorrah. And Abraham has to grapple with what God did. Pastor pointed out to me a very astute thought that when Abraham went to sleep after this conversation with the Lord, it's very likely that Abraham thought he would wake up in the morning and go to see if Sodom and Gomorrah were still there, expecting it to still be there. But Abraham gets up, the text tells us, early in the morning and goes out to see Sodom and Gomorrah, and he sees smoke billowing from where it used to be. And the text tells us nothing of Abraham's response except that he was silent. There's no further conversation with the Lord about this. Abraham is left with his thoughts. And we'll talk about that at the end of the message, because I think the narrator wants you and me to stand with Abraham in that moment. He wants us to be next to him, to feel his presence, looking at Sodom and coming to a conclusion on what God is like and who he is. So, we want to get started with these three storylines. The first is God's righteousness. God's righteousness. You see, we learned last week that God invited Abraham into his decision-making process in deciding what he's going to do to Sodom. He let him in the throne room, as it were, to hear the heavenly counsel on what's going to happen to Sodom. And the reason he did this is because he wanted Abraham to understand his righteousness. He wanted Abraham to understand God's righteousness so that Abraham could be very proficient in passing down that righteousness to subsequent generations. That's the idea. He's training his son so that his son becomes a good father, to train his sons, so that his sons become good fathers to train their sons and daughters. That's the idea. So he's saying, come alongside me and be my apprentice as I make this decision of these people, of Sodom and Gomorrah. So this is the idea. And I want you to catch this because this is really important. The central question to this text, the important point of this text, surfaces within the text, and that question is this. Genesis 18:25, Abraham says to the Lord, or asks the Lord, shall not the judge of all the earth do what is just? Shall not the judge of all the earth do what is just? I want you to read that with me, would you please? Shall not the judge of all the earth do what is just? That's the question. And God wants Abraham to know in his gut, he wants him to know in his bones that the answer to that is yes, I will. I will do what is just. I will do what is right. So he comes to Abraham, and even though he doesn't need to send his angels into Sodom and Gomorrah to see how bad it actually is, because he already knows how bad it actually is, but he's going through these motions for Abraham so that Abraham can see that God does not do something willy-nilly. He makes his decisions very thoroughly. And this is who God is. This is who his son is. If I told our Connect group last week, when you look at Jesus in the New Testament, before he raises Lazarus from the dead, do you know what he says in his prayer? He prays to the Father. But in that prayer, he says this, Father, I'm saying these things not because you need to hear them, but so that the people around me will hear me saying them to you. In other words, we don't need to have this talk. You and I were on the same page, but I'm going to have this talk so that all these bystanders can hear me have this talk. So this is how God works, and this is what he's doing with Abraham. He's saying, Abraham, I'm going to go through this dog and pony show of having these people go and these angels go and check things out so that you can see how thorough I am. But I already know Sodom's hearts better than they know their own hearts. But I'm going to do this anyway so you get it, so you know me more. And so it's just like a father, it's just like I mentioned, Jaron, stooping down to someone that doesn't have as much information as they do about life and using an illustration or a method that they are familiar with so that they can know what he's doing and what he's talking about. God wants Abraham to know beyond a shadow of a doubt that he is a just God, a righteous God. If you looked up the passages last week in the Connect Group questions, you see that justice and righteousness are the foundation of God's throne. This is who he is. In another psalm, it says that he loves righteousness and justice. He loves it. Just like you might talk about a TV show you love or a food you love. God loves, he loves righteousness and justice. So he wants to demonstrate to the reader, he wants to demonstrate to Abraham, he wants to demonstrate to Israel that he is righteous and just. And the reason he needs to do this is because that truth has been jeopardized. Where has it been jeopardized? Well, it was jeopardized when that fink, the serpent, came into the garden and started whispering false truths about God, and Adam did not take him off the tree and crush his head. The whispers got into his mind and got into his heart, and as they got in, he followed suit with that thought that God isn't good, God isn't righteous, God isn't just, and he's keeping something from me, so I'm going to take a bite of this fruit. And that false understanding of God, that he's against us instead of for us. And if you go out in the world and ask them that question, do you think if you started going to church and you started obeying the Bible, your life would get better or worse? The answer is worse. Because they all believe the lie that Satan told them. That lie's passed on through Adam and Eve throughout all subsequent generations. And God is going to Abraham and he's saying, I need to undo this lie for the welfare and benefit of humanity. So I'm going to show you the truth about who I am. So I'm going to make a decision here as it relates to Sodom and Gomorrah. And I want you, Abraham, the father of the nations, to watch me in my throne room make this decision. And you tell me at the end of the day if I made the right one or the wrong one. You watch, you assess, you judge. And he wants us to do the very same thing. So that any time you and I are tempted to doubt whether what God is doing in our lives is good or bad, for our benefit or for our demise, we can say, I don't get this right now. This seems like the worst possible thing in the world that could befall me right now. But I trust that in some way it's right, it's just, and it's good. And it will work out in my best interests, even if it costs me my life. Many saints, all saints, have faced that question. And we will face it as well. And so he uses Sodom and Gomorrah as a baseline of his justice to understand that it's good. He wants it to be a paradigm for future generations to say, is God good? Is God just? Oh yeah, Sodom. He did that to Sodom. He's good. He's right. He's just. He wants this to be so imprinted on us that we never doubt that he's good and just and all wise. And so, we're in Genesis 19. That's the point of Genesis 19. Thus far in Genesis, all we know, the narrator has really started on the outskirts. He started sort of with a very wide margin of Sodom, and he's slowly taking us into the heart of Sodom. So back in Genesis 13, when Lot chose to live there, he said that Sodom was filled with wicked men. And so all that is a reputation. You're headed to a city, you've never been there before. You ask somebody, hey, what's this city like? They give you its reputation. This is what we hear of this place. Genesis 13 gives us the reputation, but then it goes a little bit further in Genesis 14, after Sodom and Gomorrah were captured, and we get to see Abram rescue them by the grace of God with his 318 men. And then we see the king of Sodom and this king of Salem, Melchizedek, come to Abram at the same time, the text points out. Genesis 14. So both kings are present. Melchizedek speaks up first. So you got one king waiting for the other king to finish. And Melchizedek says, bless God Most High for him giving you this victory. He's the possessor of heaven and earth. And Melchizedek just gives glory to God for the rescue of that he gave to Abraham and his men. And you got to picture, the king of Sodom is standing there. His whole people just got rescued. He's watching Melchizedek give glory to God. He's watching Abraham give him a tenth of everything Melchizedek says. So he's agreeing with Melchizedek. God, the king of Sodom, knows that God gave Abram the victory, and he's observing all this. Now it's his turn. What does the king of Sodom do? He says, give me the people, you keep the goods, we'll be done. So you got to picture, it's like you and another believer are praising God for something, and an unbeliever standing by, and they're kind of like, glad that's over. Now, here's what I need to talk to you about. That's what it's like. So, thus far, the narrator of Genesis has shown us the reputation of Sodom. It's ventured in a little closer and showed you the president of Sodom, what he's like. But now it's important to take you into the guts of Sodom, because he wants you to know this place. Because we get to know who God is by what God hates in many cases. So he says, let's go. Let's venture in. Just in case you think I'm going to do the wrong thing. Let's get a good, nasty look at the vileness of this wicked and deplorable and abominable place. So let's go closer. Told you the reputation, showed you the leader, but now we want to look at them. We want to look at these people. And so we venture into the city gates. You got to know that the city gates, I've been laughing with the men in the morning. It seems that First Baptist City Gates is by the coffee table. That's where the men gather in the morning and discuss the current events and what's going on. And this is sort of what the city gate was like for the towns in the Near East. They were large places that had seating area so that the village, the town folk could gather there. Commentator Nahum Sarna points out that the city gate would be essentially parallel to what we call our civic centers of the community. At the city gate, gossip would be exchanged and disseminated. Business would be transacted at the city gate, and justice, Sarna writes, would be dispensed with the town's full participation. So this is the civic center. And what's fascinating as these wanderers, these angels that nobody knows, nobody's seen before, they enter the city gates. And it's interesting, commentators point out, that the only person to greet them is Lot. The only person to offer them shelter is Lot. And in the ancient Near East, even in the States, hospitality to wanderers and passers through was notorious for if you were a good person, a generous person, or a not so generous person. So people would put light in their windows back in the day, and that would say, "We have room." And this goes all the way back to the Near East, where when you were traveling through, the goodness or badness of a town was whether it would take you in and care for you. And the only person to do that for these angels appears to be Lot. Only person to greet them. There's people there. This is where everybody hangs out. So I want you to get the picture of a fresh inmate going to get his clothes, notoriously the most vile prison in America. That's the feeling that these angels would have had, or any visitors to Sodom and Gomorrah would have likely had as they entered into this place. Lot very likely got his standing for Abraham's success. We'll talk about that later. But these people walk in and they look, and it's as though you're walking in the old westerns into a bar, and everybody just looks, and you know it's not going to be good. That's what's happening to these two angels as they come. So Lot comes to them and he offers them shelter. And what's so fascinating is that these angels are coming into Sodom with whose perspective? Lot's or God's? Well, it's tough to answer that question because Peter tells us that Lot was righteous. So to a degree, Lot was disgusted with what happened there, but he still made his choice to live there. And these angels, beyond a shadow of a doubt, are walking in with God's perspective. And so when Lot offers them shelter, their response is, no. We would rather sleep in the streets than in a house of Sodom. So we're getting a glimpse of God's perspective as the angels come. But in that, like I said, we see that Lot is not entirely, though he's living in Sodom, he's not entirely of Sodom. So it says that he forces the angels to stay in his house. He strongly persuades them. One commentator says the Hebrew communicates the thought that he twists their arm to stay in his house. So he's saying, no, please, you listen to me. You cannot sleep in these streets at night. You can't be here when it gets dark. You got to be in a house with a door that locks. Trust me. So the angels listen to Lot, and they go into his house. And that evening, which is so fascinating, that Sodom is so associated with darkness. That evening, Genesis wants to show you just how bad this place is in its innards. Genesis 19:4. Look at how it exhausts how many people were there. The men of the city, the men of Sodom, both young and old. That's what we call a merism. And a merism is a literary tool that takes two opposite extremes and puts them right together to communicate entirety or wholeness. So he says, from the young to the old. In other words, everybody. But in case you didn't already know that, he goes on and says, all the people to the last man surrounded the house. So what he's trying to say is, this is all the people in Sodom. This is everybody coming out for what's about to happen to these two angels. Everybody crowding around to see what's become known as the sodomy of Sodom. You need to catch the broadness of that description. Down to the last man. The narrator wants you to catch that this is a fully, entirely saturated, brimming over city with vileness. Down to its last, youngest person. Lest you ever question the goodness and graciousness of God. God was ready to let this city exist, continue to exist, if there were merely 10 people that were righteous in it. So this is a place fully saturated with filth. So Lot goes out. But the narrator's not done. He still wants you to know how bad this place actually is. So he shows Lot goes out, and Lot shuts the door behind him. That's very significant, because Lot's saying, if I leave this door open, they're bound to bum rush me and get in the house. And so Lot is realizing what he needs to do to protect who's inside the house. And Lot goes out, and it absolutely astonishes us. But it's revealing, it's telling for how bad this place is. Lot knows that reasoning with these people is not going to make a lick of difference. They've come to be gratified, and gratified they will be. Otherwise, disaster will befall everyone. And so Lot, in his warped and terribly messed up mind, offers his daughters. He knows that they have to get what they came for. And so in Lot's screwed up thinking, he offers what he thinks will satisfy. But I want you to catch the narrator's point of sharing this, because here's what it's doing. We're seeing these men, one of homosexuality, take over these other two men. And we know how grievous homosexuality is in the rest of the Old Testament. So we know how awful, how base this is what they're about to do. But we also know that Lot's response offer is base. But here's the thing. It's an inch above what they were going to do, in that it's at least natural for a male to be attracted to a female. And they even reject that in preference for the homosexual act. So what the narrator's trying to do is, Lot offered them an inch above their deplorable act, and they rejected that inch. That's how unbelievably low and base these men are. But it gets worse. They're going to do what they wanted to do to the angels, to Lot now. And now the angels reach out and they pull Lot in and they strike the men. And the Hebrew communicates that it's a brilliant flash of light. So you have police officers and SWAT teams have these devices that boom, light, and it blinds everyone. That's essentially what the angels seem to have done to these men. But the narrator goes on and he says, you would think, when they are blind as bats, they would start trying to get home or quit their efforts. But he says, no. I want you to know how bad these guys were. They wore themselves out in groping for the door. In other words, these men were as hell-bent as you could possibly imagine towards destruction and evil and atrocity. And again, the narrator is looking at the reader. The narrator is looking at Abraham, and he's saying, is it enough yet? Is it enough yet? Are you ready for God to pull the trigger now? Where are you at on this? How much more do you need to see to trust God's righteous judgment on this city? And so they make their case to Lot, and Lot dallies. He dilly-dallies. He waits around. He goes to his sons-in-law and he says, look, we got to get out of here. They think he's joking. That's how far off righteous judgment is from his own sons-in-law. The Jewish rabbis interpreted this passage, and they understood that Sodom likely treated its visitors this way so that visitors, there would be a notorious reputation for their city that no visitors would ever want to get there so that they could keep all the produce and all the wealth for themselves. That's how they interpreted this passage. They wanted no one to infringe on their wealth. So what's the point of all this? The point of all this is to demonstrate to you and me that these people are wholly damnable. All these nitty-gritty, awful details which we shudder to hear and for our children to hear is to demonstrate the answer to the question of Genesis 18:25, shall not the judge of all the earth do what is just? The answer is an affirmative yes. He will, Abraham. You don't need to worry about that. And as if that weren't enough, there are numerous details in Genesis 19 that mirror Genesis 6 through 9 in the flood, as if to show the reader, do you remember the flood? Well, Sodom and Gomorrah and the people who lived there were just like the people that God got rid of over the face of the earth before the flood. Listen to just a few of the details, and I could have given more. Though on different scales, there's mass destruction of something in its entirety, both in the flood and of Sodom and Gomorrah. Number two, the purpose for the destruction is the same in each event, removing wicked people. Number three, in both events, the judgment comes in the form of rain, and it's the same Hebrew word. In the flood, it was rain like as in water. In the rain of Sodom and Gomorrah, it rained sulfur and fire. Number four, in each event, one righteous man and his family escape. Noah in the flood, Lot and his family in Sodom. Number five, in each event, the righteous man that escapes has an intoxicating encounter with wine. And then after that, number six, he's mistreated by his children. Noah with Ham, Lot and his two daughters. And I think the point in all of this and having these parallels and similarities and congruencies is to say, look, Sodom and Gomorrah was just as bad as the flood people. You see, we have to get to the understanding that God gives Ezekiel in Ezekiel 14, and that is this, that there are some towns, look at the verse, Son of man, when a land sins against me by acting faithlessly, and I stretch out my hand against it and break its supply of bread and send famine upon it and cut off from it man and beast, even if these three men, Noah, Daniel, and Job, were in it, they would not deliver but their own lives by their righteousness, declares the Lord God. What's he saying to Ezekiel? He's saying, Ezekiel, there are places that get so bad, so unbelievably bad, that if I took the three most righteous men in all the earth and put them in that city, they couldn't help that city at all. That's how far gone cities can get. And that's how far gone Sodom was. So friends, do not doubt the justice of God. I have a friend that took a class with D.A. Carson. You've heard Pastor and I quote him, Pastor Alex quote him several times throughout our ministry. And D.A. Carson wears reading glasses, and he speaks very articulately. And my friend who was in his class, there were several students in the class, was sharing a moment where D.A. Carson was talking about the tendencies of pastors to take on passages such as this, where God extinguishes a civilization or extinguishes a people, removes them from the face of the earth. And he says the tendency of the pastor is to sort of apologize for God in cases like this, where God seems to have been too harsh. And D.A. Carson, if you've ever heard him speak, will take moments where he lowers his reading glasses to the tip of his nose and will just silently scan the audience. And my friend said he did that when he said that about pastors apologizing for God. And he says, students, don't you ever apologize for a holy act from a holy God. And that's what the narrator of Genesis is seeking to communicate to us. He's showing a baseline of God's justice, a foundation from which Abraham can build in the future generations. And friends, this might seem foreign to you. This might seem sort of distinct and say, well, that doesn't really have a whole lot to do with my life. But let me get to the root of how it has directly to do with your life. You see, do you remember when Jesus tells Peter that he needs to be crucified? Do you remember how Peter responds to that? He says to Jesus, far be it from you to do that. What's Peter doing? Peter's saying, Jesus, you're about to do something that I don't think's right. I don't agree with. And I'm going to tell you I don't agree with it. You shouldn't do it. You know what Jesus says to Peter? Get behind me, Satan. In other words, Peter, I don't need a counselor right now. I'm doing what's best for you, and you best hush up and go along with it. But it doesn't stop there. Because later, after Jesus is resurrected from the grave, and he's walking with Peter, Jesus starts telling Peter how he's going to die. And he said, when you grow up, you dress yourself, but there's going to come a time, Peter, when someone else dresses you, and they're going to do something to you that you don't want them to do. And Peter's beginning to understand that he's going to die a martyr's death. And Peter looks behind him and he sees John and he says, what about him? You know what Jesus says to Peter in that moment? What is it to you, Peter, if it's my will that John live forever? What am I saying here? I'm saying this. You and I are in Abraham's shoes all the time, every day. When things befall us that we don't think should befall us, whether it's a red light or whether it's someone disrespecting us or gossiping or whatever it is, or whether we get mistreated in any way, or whether something happens to our house that we really didn't want to happen to our house at this moment in time, or our car or our job, and we go to God and we say, that's not right. That's not righteous. Why would you let this happen to my kid? Why would you do this? That's not okay. That's not right. We need to talk. And God just stares. The author of Hebrews, this is a long text, but I want you to catch his point. Hebrews 12, my son. In those moments when you ask and say to God, if there was anything I wish wouldn't have happened right now, it would have been the thing that just happened. In those moments when you say, God, anything but this, and this is staring me right in the face right now. The author of Hebrews says this, my son, do not regard lightly the discipline, the training of the Lord, nor be weary when reproved by him. For the Lord disciplines, he trains the one he loves, and chastises every son whom he receives. It is for discipline that you have to endure. God is treating you as sons. For what son is there whom his father does not discipline? If you are left without discipline, in which all have participated, then you are illegitimate children and not sons. Besides this, we have had earthly fathers who disciplined us, and we respected them. Shall we not much more be subject to the Father of spirits and live? For they, our earthly fathers, disciplined us for a short time as it seemed best to them. But he disciplines us for our good and that we may share in his holiness. For the moment, all discipline seems painful rather than pleasant. But later, it yields the peaceful fruit of righteousness to those who have been trained by it. Therefore, lift up your drooping hands and strengthen your weak knees and make straight paths for your feet, so that what is lame might not be put out of joint, but rather be healed. You see, the thing that you think is foreign to God is actually from God. Now, it might be wicked and it might be evil, and the person who committed it against you will surely be judged by the righteous God, but God is using it for your good. Whether that's your cancer or your cold or whatever befalls you that you wish didn't befall you, God is using this, and it's right and it's just. And the author of Hebrews says, but look, you can have discipline from God and mishandle it and have it actually make you worse off instead of better. I've heard the illustration before, maybe you as well, is that boiling water does really interesting things to different things. For instance, if you have an egg and you put it in boiling water, it hardens the egg. You take a carrot and put it in the boiling water, it softens the carrot. But if you take a coffee bean and put it in boiling water, it influences the water in a positive way. And just so, when pain comes into our lives, we can have different responses to it. We can get embittered, we can get broken in an unhealthy way, where we don't take risks for God anymore, or we can be trained by it and influence life in a positive way. Replace coffee with tea if you don't like coffee. So friends, what I'm telling you, what the author of Hebrews is telling you, is kiss the rod that disciplines you and let it escort you into the holiness that God has for you. So we go to the second storyline, much shorter than the first. And that storyline is Lot's poor decisions. We see Lot is Abraham's nephew. He starts this journey with Abraham, sort of watching Abraham make decisions. He's very likely younger than Abraham. Abraham's taken him with him because Lot's dad, his brother, passed away. So he's assumed responsibility for his brother's son. And so he's moving on, and as they go to the promised land and Lot follows Abraham there, the first thing they encounter is a famine. And Lot gets to see Abraham make a very poor decision and leave the promised land to go to Canaan, they're in Canaan, to leave Canaan and go to Egypt, where it's well watered by the Nile. It's more fertile, the crops are more trustworthy, more regular. So Lot sees Abraham make that decision. Lot sees that decision turn out absolutely horrible when Pharaoh takes Abraham's wife Sarah into his own. Lot also saw God save Abraham from that terrible decision and redeem Sarah from Pharaoh, give him back to Abraham, and get them out of Dodge. And so Lot has seen Abraham make good decisions and bad decisions, but he's seen God act in faithfulness on behalf of Abraham. And it's after that journey in Egypt that God gives Abraham a scan of the land, and Abraham is so freed from being worried about water or no water. He says to Lot, Lot, you pick whatever you want. As long as I'm with God, I know I'm safe. So you can have whatever you want. I don't care. And it says that Lot looked out over the land, and it says that Lot saw the Jordan Valley, which was well watered, like the garden of God, like Egypt. And Lot chooses the Jordan Valley. So this is like young Children that graduate high school, and we don't know if the parents' faith has become their faith yet. And we begin seeing that unfold as they make decision after decision after decision. And so it is with Lot. We don't know what decisions Lot's going to make, but he gets to this point, and now we're going to see what sort of man Lot is. And we find that Lot is a man that walks by sight and not by faith. So he chooses what's like Egypt. And he also chooses the trouble that's found in Egypt, in the Jordan Valley. So he goes there. Commentators point out that measurements of the Promised Land have been given, and the Jordan Valley is on the outskirts of the Promised Land, if not beyond the Promised Land. And not only is it far away from getting the edges or outside of the Promised Land, it's also east. And we know that any time in Genesis thus far someone goes east, it's always a bad omen, because the Garden of God was west. And so they're moving further and further and further away from the presence of God. So the text says in chapter 13 that he lived as far as Sodom, or near to Sodom, the Hebrew can be translated. But then we find in Genesis 14 that he's not just near Sodom, he's living in Sodom. So there's an evolution taking place with Lot. And then beyond that, we find that Lot is sitting at the gate of Sodom, which very likely means that Lot is now a functioning elder of the town. He's a politician in the town. He's a leader in the town. It's not just that. There's more to Sodom getting in Lot. Lot welcomes the angels, but he doesn't seem to recognize that they're angels like Abraham seemed to. Abraham refers to the angels as Adonai. He seems to refer to them as being God or that sort of thing. He recognizes there's something special. Lot just says to them, essentially in the Hebrew, sirs, gentlemen. So he doesn't seem to have the same spiritual apprehension or recognition as Abraham has. Not only that, when he goes out to speak with the men of Sodom, what does he call them? Brothers. The angels refuse to even stay in the house of these people, let alone call them siblings. Lot says, brothers. Lot forces the angels to stay in Sodom, to stay with him, and then the angels have to force Lot to leave Sodom. Lot's given his sons-in-laws, or given his daughters sons-in-laws that are clearly rabble of Sodom, and it's very likely we find out with Lot's wife that he probably chose a wife from Sodom. And then, ironically, Lot offers up his daughters to the men of Sodom. And in an ironic twist of events, the one who will violate his daughters is not the men of Sodom, but himself. It will befall his own head. And then, beyond all imagination, Lot chooses Sodom because of its lushness, because of its greatness, because of its reliability. And what sort of environment does Lot end up living in at the end of the account? Well, Lot's living in a cave. That's where Lot's living. And so, friends, it's sad to take a look at Lot's decisions and see that his last mention in the Old Testament is of him living in a cave with his daughters taking advantage of him. And friends, I have to tell you, although there was a semblance of righteousness in Lot, although he was grieved by what he saw, it didn't stop him from walking in the roads and the streets of Sodom. And friends, I got to tell you, there are believers in this church that are locking arms with things they ought not lock arms with. They're going places entertained, choosing interests that are contrary to God's design and will leave them and their families in awful, despicable places. It's in 1 Corinthians 3 that we get a very clear picture of what type of man Lot was. 1 Corinthians 3, 12 to 15, it says, "Now if anyone builds on a foundation with gold, silver, precious stones, wood, hay, straw, each one's work will become manifest, for the day will disclose it, because it will be revealed by fire, and the fire will test what sort of work each one has done. If the work that anyone has built on the foundation survives, he will receive a reward. If anyone's work is burned up, he will suffer loss, though he himself will be saved, but only as through fire." And I got to tell you, it's hard to imagine Paul wasn't thinking a lot when he wrote this passage. Lot had a lot of things. He had more than Abraham. He had a house, apparently. Abraham's still living in tents. But that house was burned up. Lot had nothing to show of value for his life's decisions. But he was a believer. And friends, I don't want you to squander what God's given you. I want you to live in such a way, I want myself to live in such a way that my works go beyond me into heaven and will not be accumulated here. And that's the difference between Abraham and Lot. And so finally, we come to Abraham and our response in Genesis 19, 27, 28. It says, "And Abraham went early in the morning to the place where he had stood before the Lord, and he looked down toward Sodom and Gomorrah and toward all the land of the valley. And he looked, and behold, the smoke of the land went up like a smoke of a furnace." You see, Sodom, Lot, they all had opportunities to respond to God's will. They were rescued by God. Lot knew he was rescued by God when Abraham got him. He saw Abraham get rescued from Pharaoh. The king of Sodom knew God rescued Abraham and his people, or rescued Lot and his people, but they didn't respond. And friends, the most astonishing truth of all of this is that you and I have witnessed such a greater rescue of God than any of the Sodomites did. Look at our last passage, Matthew 11, 23 to 24. Jesus says, "And you, Capernaum," and he could say, "And you, First Baptist, will you be exalted to heaven?" Now consider his response to Capernaum. "You will be brought down to Hades. For if the mighty works done in you had been done in Sodom, it would have remained until this day. But I tell you that it will be more tolerable on the day of judgment for the land of Sodom than for you. Why is it worse for Capernaum? Because they witnessed the works of Jesus Christ." And friends, we've witnessed more than Capernaum. What does that do to us? What responsibility does that put on our shoulders? Friends, Abraham looks down and he sees these two essentially parallel folks of Sodom and Lot. And he has to make a decision. Will I walk with Sodom? Will I walk with Lot? Or will I walk by faith and not by sight? Friends, you have the same decisions. Will you walk how your parents walked in the things they shouldn't have done? Will you walk like our culture walks in the things that it shouldn't do? Or will you walk like the Bible tells you to walk? And will you stand with Abraham? Maybe you don't have as much as the world has. Maybe you don't have the thrills that Lot saw in Sodom, but you will have God, and God is enough. Amen? Amen. I'll ask the musicians to come.